joining Nico in
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nico Connolly with America's Promise Alliance. I'm here in Redmond, Oregon for a really exciting event, and we are excited to welcome all of you joining via the live stream. On behalf of the entire team at America's Promise, we're excited you can join, and we look forward to having an interactive and rich discussion today. We think that this event, Creating a Culture of Care, Lessons from St. Louis and Central Oregon on Trauma-Informed Approaches to Supporting Young People in Schools, is a really good opportunity to connect important conversations and solutions that are happening in these two communities to communities and change makers and champions across the country. And I'm looking forward to learning with you all from the amazing group of panelists and speakers that we have today, but also looking forward to learning from you and your unique insights that you can bring to this conversation. We have a fantastic group of speakers and panelists today. We have national leaders, regional health and education experts, as well as folks who work in school buildings to support young people. And we've broken this 90-minute session into 3 different really fascinating sessions. The first is going to be a session that my colleague Monica Kinchlow is going to do, and it's really going to focus on framing the rest of the day and talking about how a whole child vision must be informed by a deeper understanding of what's happening inside of children, inside their minds. Second, we're going to have an awesome conversation around authentic youth engagement and why it's critical to have it in all of our initiatives, but especially those that take place in schools. And then third, we're going to do a deeper dive around trauma-informed practices and supporting students' mental health needs in schools. And we have a great panel of local leaders from Central Oregon, but also from St. Louis, who are going to talk about issues like equity, measuring impact, and the policy implications of their work. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. We are here in Central Oregon at Redmond at the High Desert Education Service District, but we don't want the conversation to be limited to the people in this room. We're looking to you all on the live stream to join and participate and bring your unique wisdom to this conversation, and there are a couple ways to do that. First, you can use the YouTube live chat function to add your perspective, share your stories, introduce yourselves to other people that are tuning in from across the country. You can also ask questions. We're gonna have a Q&A after the panel discussion, and if you write your questions into the YouTube chat function, we'll be able to send those directly to the panelists and have them answered. Also, there's another great way to participate. We will ask you for a one-word response at one point in the program, and on the screen, there'll be specific instructions for how you can respond to that, so don't worry about that just yet. Lastly, I just want to mention that we'll be having this conversation on social media as well, using the hashtag #EverySchoolHealthy, and that's a really good opportunity to not only start a conversation there, but continue the conversation emerging from here today. So that's a bunch of housekeeping things, but we look forward to having you in this conversation, and I look forward to learning with you. And now we'll transition over to my colleague, Monica Kinchlow, from America's Promise Alliance, who leads a lot of our national initiatives. Monica?
Thanks, Nico. Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Kinchlow. I work with an amazing team at America's Promise Alliance to put forward a vision for young people that actively calls upon their lived experience and encourages systems, including school systems, to adapt to better match the developmental needs of young people. We're a national nonprofit whose greatest asset is our alliance of over 400 youth-serving organizations. I want to start by recognizing Katie Condit, president of Better Together Central Oregon, and Stacy Smith, director of curriculum and instruction in Crook County, Oregon, who agreed to co-host this live stream event with us. We thank you for your willingness to share your experience and your success with the national audience. We also want to thank Emily Luft, who's joining us from St. Louis today, to share the experience of her work on the ground there. And I want to share a special thank you to Nico Connolly, who's really been the backbone of all of this work, and I want to thank him for his commitment to this campaign and the community work. We're thrilled to be here in Central Oregon, but you may be wondering, why Oregon? One of our campaigns is the Every School Healthy campaign, which articulates a vision for school environments where young people are safe, supported, and empowered. A healthy school is one where every person cultivates the social, emotional, physical, and mental health of every person, young people and adults. Perhaps the most exciting part of this campaign is that we get to work with communities across the country who are actively pursuing this vision of a healthy school right now. And in this event, we're able to bring together two of those communities, Crook County and St. Louis, Missouri, because they independently came to the conclusion that many of their young people were coming to school showing signs of trauma. And something had to change. They are experiencing the kind of success and tough work that we think is worth sharing with more people and more communities. We've been tracking the work here in Oregon with particular interest because it's happening in a broader social policy and practice context. The statewide graduation rate is one of the lowest in the country, and the mental health needs of young people are increasing and unmet. Many believe these two things are connected. It may sound bleak, but there is opportunity coming in the form of the Oregon Success Act, which recently passed in the state legislature, which will invest $1 billion into schools over the next few years, in part to support things like social and emotional health, trauma-informed practice, and mental health services. As anyone working in public education knows, young people's lives outside of school often may cause them to arrive at school feeling isolated, stressed, or worried. I can recall one time in my own fourth grade classroom years ago when a student, we'll call her Lacey, became seemingly frustrated with the math problem we were working on. She flipped her paper over, she let out a frustrated sigh, and proceeded to sit on the floor underneath her desk. I didn't miss a beat. I kneeled down and I whispered, "What's going on?" And she whispered back, "My mom didn't come home last night." I nodded in understanding and said, "Okay, take the time you need and I'll check in a few minutes." Lacey continued to sit underneath her desk. And you'll just have to trust me when I say that not another student blinked in the class. They all kept working. We had already agreed that different people need different things at different times, and that's okay. Manifestations of trauma are not a young person's fault. For developing brains, it can be hard to navigate adversity. And we're in a time when we can no longer ignore all that we know about how young people develop. And we need to challenge ourselves to see that sometimes their learning environments and the adults in those learning environments may not be helping them to thrive. We know more about our brains than we ever have before. It's believed that the brain develops from the front to the back and from the inside out. Each part of the brain serves a different function and important functions. And each of these functions develop in fits and starts over time, not all at once, and with varying degrees of intensity. We now know that development occurs most intensely from birth to age 5, the 0 to 5 range, and in a really intense period during adolescence, roughly from 13 to 18. And we now know that development occurs over a much longer period of time from 0 to age 25. For many adults, including me, this causes a profound shift in how we should view our interactions with young people. And as we move through childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, each of us is processing the external world and internally managing that experience. Plus, we are internally developing a sense of safety and identity. Each of us does this in a way that intertwines a triple helix of social, emotional, and cognitive functions. When we're just 2 years old, we ask, "Who cares for me?" And the answer is rooted in touch, tone of voice, and responsiveness to basic needs. This is where social and emotional attachment begins. And when we're 14 years old, we ask, "How far can I go?" And the answer is rooted in a sense of autonomy and the ability to return to a safe place when we fail. This is where advanced social and cognitive development occurs. When we're 23 years old, we ask, "What will I do on my own?" And the answer is rooted in having a sense of possibility and confidence that social, emotional, and cognitive skills will carry us forward. During each of these phases of growing up and getting through, life happens. And for an increasing number of young people, that life includes multiple and compounding adversities, some of which result in trauma. The stress hormone cortisol and the love hormone dopamine are always ebbing and flowing. And when living among challenges, the stress hormone cortisol may become part of a young person's day-to-day. Surges in stress that happen often over time can put a young person at risk of poor grades, being suspended, or leaving school altogether. As adults, they may experience cancer, heart disease, and other mental illness. But this isn't the full story. We can counter surges in stress by focusing on loving relationships and surrounding youth with a culture of care. Skill building and knowledge acquisition happen best in environments where young people have these things. A person can heal from trauma in part by learning and living in supportive relationships that enable all kinds of growth. According to the original CDC survey of adverse childhood experiences, my own score would have been a 7 out of 10. I didn't even know what an adverse childhood experience was until 20 years after I left home. And in reflecting on why I made it out of childhood trauma and into self-sufficient adulthood, my mom was a stabilizing force, to be sure, but two other things played an important role. First was talk therapy during my first and second years of high school, and second were supportive teachers who challenged me academically and never judged me for being quiet but fierce. And by the way, I think this background of mine is exactly why I handled the situation with Lacey the way I did. But what drives me nuts is its total chance that I was her teacher in that moment. Another teacher might have forced her to sit back in her desk, and another teacher might have sent her to the principal's office. Imagine what it would be like if Lacey had had any teacher that year with the knowledge, ability, and class culture to meet her physical and psychological safety needs in that moment. When we know young people, and when we know the science of learning and development, it becomes painfully clear that some of our business as usual ways have to change. And our goal for the rest of our time together here in Oregon is to elevate the experience and learning from community and school leaders who are actively changing right now. This work demands us to move from doing things to young people to with young people, from punishment and consequence to relationships and root causes. And we have to move from viewing young people as empty vessels waiting for information to be poured in to viewing young people as whole beings right from the beginning who are growing and changing dynamically every day. So I invite you now to lean in and learn from the community and school leaders gathered here today and how they're using trauma-informed practice across school systems to create a culture of care. I'm now inviting Emily Luft from Alive and Well Communities in St. Louis, Missouri. She's the program director there. And Tamara Harris of Mosaic Medical here in Crook County, Oregon. Emily and Tamara will lead an interactive discussion on the importance of youth engagement as we proceed with this kind of work. Thanks.
So because we're talking about youth engagement in this next section, we want you to be engaged. So there are two important ways that we want to hear and share your voice during this conversation. First is through an interactive tool where you will be able to supply a very important one-word answer to the question that we're focusing on here today, which is, in one word, what do you value most about youth involvement and leadership? On your screen, you'll see that you can use a tool called Menti, enter that code right at the top, and share your one-word answer. What do you value most about youth involvement or leadership? Additionally, while Tamara and I talk today, answering these questions and talking more about the essential nature of engaging youth voice, we want you to share those positive success stories you already have in your schools and communities of how youth make your work better, stronger, and more sustainable. So in the YouTube chat function, please share those stories. You might just hear them mentioned later today. So Tamara, I would love for us to just start by answering this question for ourselves. In one word and an explanation, what do you value most about youth engagement and voice?
Connection. I love the fact that when you engage youth and you encourage their youth voice and you build a connection with them, and then while you're building that connection, you're creating trust, and you can, hopefully prevent some of the trauma that might be coming their way, or at least build the trust and the connection where they can work with you and talk with you about building resilient skills. We can talk more about that with the trauma-informed piece.
Yeah,
That's
great.
coming
So youth engagement is sort of an intervention in itself.
Correct.
Right. I would say for me, when I think about what I value most about youth voice, I really think about the creativity that they bring. They have the benefit of not yet knowing all those things that might be going through our adult brains of what makes an idea hard or why something might be difficult to achieve. They usually can just see right to the real answer.
Yes.
And share that without that kind of jaded filter. And I think so often they're just willing to say the things that maybe we have that little voice in us that says, but we filter it through. They're there bringing that right to the surface. So we have answers coming in already through Mentimeter. And so we can see those. Those will be coming up on your screen as well. But one of the themes we already see coming up is the perspective they bring.
Exactly, and it's so refreshing. And I think as adults, we're just trained to say, this is the way it's always been, this is the way we've always done it. And youth just challenge that. And if we can just sit back, we'll learn so much and allow them to express that.
Yeah, and they have that insight of actually being inside all of the systems and communities that we say we want to be focusing on and helping to heal. I'll never forget in St. Louis, a couple of years ago, we brought together youth and we just asked them this very simple question of what would make a school safe for you? And there were so many adult perspectives in that space that we're thinking about physical safety and how we keep our kids just literally safe in schools in 2019. But when we asked them, their perspective was, we need adults who talk to us.
Yes.
Right? We need people who listen to us. We need people who are there who know how to say, like, hey, let's have a conversation about something other than academics. They had the insight, right, of what safety meant to them.
They did, and I think another aspect of that I've heard on a youth panel before is that don't be afraid to talk to us. We know that there's things out there, and we as adults we don't value the fact that they know what's going on rather than have that authentic conversation with them. So we engage them in the topics that they want to talk about. That's how you can build that as well.
Yeah, and I think even that happens at such a young age, right? Our kids from a really early age see a truth about the world. And I think we sometimes get stuck in that, how do we protect them or shield that from them from that truth? But they're walking in already sort of knowing what it feels like to live in this world. And so how do we value that and see that?
Exactly. And how do we give them the tools to move forward and to embrace that? And I think that's part of that engagement as well. And how do we partner together?
Absolutely. So I know we're continuing to get some answers rolling in on the Mentimeter in terms of what we value about youth voice and youth engagement. I think one of the other things that we see there is youth willingness to challenge us, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think they're constantly willing to challenge them, especially if we give them the permission to go forward. Meaning that sometimes we just push back too far.
Yeah.
But, if we just lean in to the youth and they challenge the processes, we're going to learn as well.
Yeah, I loved in Monica's introduction this morning talking about, your brain enters adolescence and starts to ask these questions of how far can I go, right? And again, I think that really incredible gift of the adolescent brain and saying, really, how far could we go is an incredible thing to just let loose and see what happens.
And I think in some of our earlier conversations in planning for this, we talked about that is when they say, hey, may I, or can I do this? We're so apt because of our own fear, I think, to say no. And then they'll say, why? Well, because I said so. And I think one of the things I love now and that I recently heard is say yes and. And so then you provide these guardrails and these barriers, and it's kind of like bumper cars. They're going to sway back and forth and they're going to hit them. But what's the worst that can happen? You're just going to get a little jarred if you hit the bumper thing. But if we say yes and put the barriers there, they realize that they don't have to push as hard, and then they're going to learn and grow as well.
Yeah, and we can help them develop that skill of
Exactly.
risk-taking and problem-solving. Exactly. So I know that there's been some incredible projects here in Central Oregon where youth have really taken the lead of transforming and improving their community. I would love for everyone to get to hear about the great work that your youth are doing.
I think one of the great things that comes to mind here is we received some grant funding to kind of create a youth environment at one of our school-based health centers. And thought, well, what a better way to do it than to ask the youth. So we went to the school administration and we just said, hey, we have this funding. We would like for the youth voice in your classes, the CTE, career technical education classes, to kind of develop what that would look like. And so we included the media class, the construction class, and all of the classes. And they kind of came up with that. All we did was give them the money. They designed the signage. And it's hard. As adults, we want to say, no, you have to do it this way. And we had to make the commitment early on as a trust amongst the adults in the rooms. We won't do that. We have to be willing to accept what comes out of that. And they did such an amazing job. It's beautiful. I wish the video was ready and we could have shared it, but it's not there yet. I mean, they're creating a video of this project. They designed the pergola. They picked the paint colors. They, created the signage, and it was just amazing. And so when you do that, they believe in you, and then they believe in this whole project, and then they're going to feel comfortable coming to, it was really to get them to the school-based health center, which can provide that safe space for them, as well as a partnership with the school. And now they're bringing their families in, and all honesty, we've seen our numbers like triple in the last 3 months because they now feel safe to come and partner.
That's really cool. It makes me think of a story from one of the schools I'm lucky enough to support in St. Louis, where they kind of looked at, okay, so how are we doing as a school? Where are our major challenges? And they decided to turn that question to their students. And their students came up with an answer that was probably quite different from, I think, what many of the adults would have said. And they said, listen, the number one place where we have a problem every day is in our bathrooms. We walk into them and they don't feel humane. We walk into them and there's nothing there that tells us that we have a high expectation of our behavior and our performance. And again, that's something where once we heard it, we're like, that makes sense.
Perfect sense.
Like, think about when you walk into the fanciest bathroom you've ever been in, and you're like, wow, I must be important. They have said all of these things out, right? It communicates a message. And they then worked with their students for a complete redesign of those bathrooms with inspirational quotes on every wall, with murals that they helped to decide, hey, what do we want in here? And really had them lead the design. They've already seen this school year a really drastic decrease in the amount of behavioral challenges they've had in that hotspot that their students identified.
Oh, that's amazing, but so very, very true.
Right.
It's kind of like if we believe you can meet to rise to here, they're going to rise to here. But if we set the bar so low, I think one of our patients said it best when one of our providers said, well, why aren't you taking your medication? And she said, well, because my grandmother believes I can't do it and I won't do it, so why should I try? And this was really a life-threatening medication that needed to be taken. And so when we kind of, we intervened and we created this trust, and she talked to us and we understood. And so when we kind of removed the grandmother from it and we allowed her to make the decisions, pick the times she would take it and how, she's doing much better. She's now taking it 6 of 7 days a week. And so again, allowing the youth voice, what isn't working. And I think I always love to hear, what's your story? I know the trauma-informed care approach is often to say, what happened to you? And then in my thought process in asking that is I always feel shame when I think what happened to me. Or if I can say, hey, Emily, what's your story? It's a story that defines you, and it's made us the wonderful people that we are today. And how do we help direct where their story goes? And so that's kind of, I always love to sit and hold space and say, what's your story? And it's just empowering.
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful question, and also a little bit of a vulnerable question. And so I think something that we've talked a lot about is when it comes to this issue of how do we actively engage youth. So often what I found, and this, I can't take credit for this quote, but that it really changed my life, was when we talk about youth engagement and youth voice, it's really not a question of how do we get our youth to have more voice and choice. It's a question of how do we get our adults to listen.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And again, I think we've talked often in preparing for this, as adults, we bring so much of our jaded perspectives or our judgments, and so oftentimes it's generational. You know, I'm of one of those generations. I like to think that I'm like really young and hip, but my children remind me often that I'm really not. But I think generationally, we bring our judgments with us, and then when we can learn and be aware of them and kind of keep them in check, we can just really, truly remove the barriers, because that's really what we want to do.
Yeah.
Youth want to talk. They want their voices to be heard. So how do we hold space and connect with them to do that? And that's by building trust and allowing them to do it their way.
Yeah, and I think, you know, another one of those kind of transformational moments for me was when I sat with a group of educators and said, you know, listen, we all say we want more youth ownership of their school experience. We want youth voice to be a bigger part of our leadership, what stands in our way. And they acknowledge the real fear, right? Of like, what happens if we say, okay, you know what, here it is, here's the thing, make the choice, do it, lead it. What happens if it goes wrong? What happens if we lose control? What happens if it fails? And, you know, we know there are so many pressures on educators today.
Oh, absolutely.
And that they're often held to standards by what their students do. And so it's scary, right?
It's terrifying.
And I think that that's such a good and important reminder that when we talk about this, too, we have to remember it's not only about those direct interactions of how are we giving youth space to share their stories, how are we personally listening to them, but also how are we structurally giving our youth opportunities to mess up and saying, hey, if you're an adult who helped to shepherd this process, that was an example of you being a great leader, of you helping students learn, not like, hey, you lost control of this one. What are you going to do to fix it?
Yeah. And I think recognizing that we are all going to fail at one point, and we've all failed to get where we're at. And so we're going to have to allow our students and our youth to fail. And I think we are terrified when you think of teachers, and there's so many pressures put on them every single day, and you have to fit in the testing, you have to fit in this. So how do you fit in that building the connection? That is really, really hard. And it's just, it's really hard. And I hear time and time again from instructors and teachers that say, I didn't learn behavioral health therapy. I didn't learn mental health. And so that's what I love so much about what we're seeing here in Crook County and Central Oregon, is it's a movement. It's truly your cafeteria workers, it's everybody like learning together how to hold that space and being given permission. And I think that is so much of it is for the administrators and your community to give you permission to acknowledge that fear and to remove the barrier.
I think that's such a great point. I'm looking at our Mentimeter, and some of the other things that came up here, right, are about relationship and connection. And I think, again, in Trauma Informed, we talk all day about how relationships the intervention, how this is what protects our kids' brains and bodies from the impacts of what they're experiencing. And I think that sometimes that can sort of feel like this challenge to adults of like, how are you going to go relate to kids, right? What are you going to do to make relationship happen? But really thinking about how those moments where we might be sharing meaningful decision making, those moments where we're actually actively listening and listening with that yes and perspective, that's our relationship building strategy right there.
It is. It's removing judgment and just allowing, I think, too, we want to fix everything. As adults and as human nature is we want to fix, rather than just listen. Because I think if we sit and listen, we're going to learn that a lot of our youth already know how to fix the problem. They just need to process, and they just need support.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'll ask for us to think about in this conversation is obviously if it was always easy for us to do this work, then it would always happen. But doing this work, and particularly doing this work across systems, can be challenging. So I don't know if you have some examples to share from your work of like where we've seen this theory go into practice and how we've been able to push past some of those challenges.
I think one of the great ways that you can see the theory come to work and why it's so beneficial and works in Central Oregon is its true community collaboration and partnership. And you do that together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really, how do we specifically implement this work in California is we have Better Together. You have all the community partners that are here today, and then we work together, we meet together, and your administration and your school district they foster that knowledge. And I think that's so much of what we do. So as Mosaic Medical, we're embedded in 6 school-based health centers throughout Central Oregon. And we partner with Crook County, we partner with Jefferson County, we partner with Deschutes County. And then we have several of their services embedded in our school-based health center. Ben Lapine Schools, we have one of their counselors, their mental health counselors embedded in our school-based health center 2 days a week. So you're integrated, you're talking, and you're giving each other permission. And then we have somebody from Deschutes County that also has a class called Design Justice that is a course credit at Ben Lapine Schools. And it's all around so many of the things that we've talked about today. And you mentor. And I think another amazing thing that we do is we also hold a mindfulness class at a couple of our schools. Our behavioral health and counselors do. So I think that's one of the ways is how do we specifically implement this work in Central Oregon is true collaboration and partnership.
Yeah, and I think that's been the hallmark of, in St. Louis, how we've approached this as well. We had been working in schools for so long and really developing these adult leaders of the work. And we realized, like, wait, there are buildings full of children here too that have that perspective. And so we launched a youth ambassador program, kind of building on our ambassadors of adults throughout our region who came together from all across St. Louis, which is a big deal in St. Louis, and really learned together, but also thought about what are they going to do as activists and as change makers to go back to their school and make it the place that they want to learn. And one of the things, again, that came clearly from them was we need to know more about this stuff, right? You're talking to our teachers all the time, educating them about these things, but we need to know about them too. And so we designed a youth empowerment workshop series that says, let's give you the information. Let's tell you what's happening in that brain you have. And let's teach you good self-care practices now. Let's not wait till you're already burnt out and we're trying to, help you at the end of it. But let's put those in place now. And then you have a story, just like you said. How do you use that story to make change? How do you connect with your own story to see how it's prepared you to create the kind of community that you want to live in?
It's empowering. So we have just under 2 minutes left. So what we wanted to do in these last 2 minutes is encourage each and every one of you that are watching this today and participating in this with us to think about somebody who's made a difference in your life that you would like to thank, an educator or a leader, and to really take a moment to do that. And I'm going to very quickly share a story, and I'd like to thank Mr. Button. He was my 9th grade teacher, or actually administrator. And I would really like to say thank you for acknowledging the fact that I had potential and to calling it out and to working with me, because at that time I didn't think I had potential. And you're one of the reasons that I'm here today, so thank you.
Thanks. I love that. I think it's so important. And I think I would love to thank Mrs. Crichton, who let little first grade Emily come in full Amelia Bedelia gear to her 3rd grade classroom and read. And it taught me that I could be a cool, respected peer of someone by doing something I was good at. And that Amelia Bedelia was awesome, and I should lean into that. And I think this idea, right, of understanding this cycle of we and everyone listening to this was a youth at some point who had a voice that they wanted to be heard by someone is really critical. And so we want to shift to ending our little portion with a challenge for you. And this challenge is asking you to think about those adults you had that made you feel seen and heard. So maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was someone in a program that you volunteered with, maybe it was a neighbor. But who was that adult when you were young that made you feel like you had those leadership potentials, who saw in you what you could really become? If you're still in contact with that person or think that you could track them down, we encourage you to actually write them a thank you note. Send that quick email. Let them know what role they played in creating the leader and change maker that you are today. If you don't know how to track them down, that is okay. Just use #EverySchoolHealthy. Give them a shout out on Twitter or on social so that we can all celebrate the adults who got it right.
Thank you, Emily and Tamara. That was fantastic and powerful. I appreciated the stories from your work, but also from your own lives. So thanks for sharing those. Now we're going to turn to a fantastic panel of educators, health leaders, and school district leaders, as well as advocates for youth generally. It's my big pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel moderator, Katie Condit, who's the executive director of Better Together Central Oregon. And aside from that, she's just a true champion of aligning diverse partners towards supporting young people and moving systems to better support our youth. Katie?
Thanks, Nico. We are so thrilled to have America's Promise Alliance here and all of our partners. We have our panel members coming up, and I would love to introduce them, and I'm thrilled to have this diverse group of folks here to talk a little bit about what this work really looks like in our schools in Central Oregon and St. Louis. And so here we have Darla Fletcher, who is a clinical social worker with Crook County School District. We have Dr. Shannon Lipscomb here from Oregon State University Cascades. Sean Reinhart, who's Executive Director of Special Programs for Ben Lapine Schools, another school district here in Central Oregon. And then Emily Left, who you just saw in our earlier segment with Alive and Well Communities in St. Louis. We have a number of great questions for these panelists, and so we'll spend some time there, and then we'll have some time at the end to open this up for questions from all of you who are watching. But before we begin, Better Together is working on instituting the practice of meaningfully recognizing and acknowledging our native lands, and so I'm going to take a moment to do that. I want to pay our respect to the elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land here in Central Oregon for generations. We also express our profound respect for all of the displaced Indigenous peoples who call Central Oregon home. The Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Paiute, the Wasco, and the Klamath Modoc and Yahuskin tribes. We pay our respects. Thank you for that, and thank you again, panel, for being here. We are gonna just dig right into what implementation of trauma-informed practices looks like. And so my first question for you is, why is trauma-informed care, specifically in schools, critical for young people? And what kinds of trauma occur in the lives of young people, and how do those impacts of trauma show up in schools?
Well, I'll go first. I think that, as we heard earlier, it's really important to implement feelings of safety, both physical, social, and emotional safety, as far as in schools. And being trauma-informed kind of helps promote some of that safety for our youth. In addition, I made notes because I'm a little nervous. Individuals who've been traumatized need to have that understanding of how it impacts their life as a whole. It's not just academics, it's not just behavioral, it's life as a whole.
Well, so I guess I take I agree with everything you said. I think about the intersection of discipline and trauma, and as director of special programs, I oversee programs related to students with disabilities, and students typically who are struggling the most with regulation. There's also intersection with disability and special education, and so when I think about why it's important is that these are primarily adult moves and teacher moves and things that we do at the school level to, and I think Monica explained it really well in her intro, that schools are adapting to the changing needs of the students that are coming through our doors every day. And so if we're going to adapt that, we have to increase our knowledge and understanding of trauma and how it affects the brain and how it affects the functioning of students, and make our schools just more accommodating.
And I think, too, what's important is whether our schools are ready for it or not, our kids are coming to us with profound lived experiences. You know, in St. Louis, the beginning of the school year in 2014, I think was an important turning point in our community. About a week before that started, we experienced the killing of Michael Brown and the uprising that followed in Ferguson. And a lot of our educators weren't prepared, didn't know how. to acknowledge that, but our kids were there. Often our kids were there on the streets, challenging those same types of community and historical traumas that had been happening for years, but we're here at a boiling point. So again, I think when we think about what are our students going through, they're going through a lot. They're going through the stuff that happens in their home. They're going through the results of living in a country where for generations folks have been harmed and disenfranchised, and then they're showing up and we're asking them to learn. So I think when we take that perspective, it becomes crystal clear why this is something that if schools want kids to be able to learn, we have to put at the forefront.
Thank you. So how are trauma-informed practices being implemented in schools and in Central Oregon and both in St. Louis? What does it look like to be in a school where adults have been trained in trauma-informed practices?
Well, so I work within the school district at Crook County, and we've been able to, thanks to a grant from America's Promise, we were able to implement 3 full-time counselors, so 2 at the elementary level, 1 at our alternative high school population, which has been amazing. We've also had all of our classified and certified staff trained in trauma-informed care, and then 12 additional additional training for 12 to support our buildings and to continue this work throughout and to help support teachers as they're learning and to give them the support that they need to support the students that they're serving.
And I'd say, in St. Louis, we've got more than 80 buildings who are taking on this journey. And I'd say we have 80 different versions of what that looks like. I always come back to one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Patsy Carter in Missouri, who said that fundamentally, trauma-informed schools look like places where kids can learn. Mm-hmm. Right? That we can talk about all the programming that goes into it, but all of that goes to lead to a place where kids' brains are actually accessible to learning. And so we see things like built-in structural times for engagement. We have some schools that are also experimenting with what it looks like to give our young people freedom, right? Adolescents want time to connect with each other. What happens if we say, okay, here's your 45 minutes? And helping them learn through that, as well as schools that are really revamping their discipline policies, who are retraining their teachers, who are shifting resources to make sure that there are those adults around and building on the strengths they already have as schools.
Great. I would add too, and when I think I've worked a lot in the early learning space with the real littles, and one of the things we are really focused on there is ensuring that the teachers are supported in whatever they need to be able to notice what's going on with each individual child. That's a really hard thing to do when you have a classroom full of littles. And it's hard at every age. But being able to notice and identify those individual needs and respond sensitively and supportively to those differences.
One thing that I would also add is just that trauma-informed practices is a way of life. It's not just something that is done like while on the job. So it's going to take some minutes and some supports just for our staff as well to get comfortable and to be able to be their best selves also with this. So
Thank you.
So I'm going to switch focus here to talk a little bit about how we're measuring trauma-informed practices, what that looks like. So how are leaders in Central Oregon and St. Louis thinking about measuring the impacts of trauma-informed practices in schools? What does that look like? How do we talk about successes, and what are we looking for in terms of measurement?
So I'd say fundamentally, for us, in a trauma-informed concept of evaluation, we should be evaluating based on what that community's definition of success is. And so I think in part, we use some tools in terms of organizational assessments, tools like attitudes related to trauma-informed care to measure staff changes. But really, I think for us, the narrative as well as the quantitative data that shows, is this school changing what they care about? So if their come to for this work is, hey, our teachers are all burnt out and we're losing a third of them every year, the evaluation strategy that's going to tell the effective story for that school is how many teachers are we keeping? If their come to is that, our kids are doing well, except when we disaggregate our data and we see how we're failing our Black and brown children, then looking at that, are we actually closing disparities, is going to be the most important way to evaluate their work. And so we try to strike that balance of, are we able to show continued progress in this direction, but also you and your community should be defining success and holding yourselves accountable to that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting to hear you talk about the balance between the individual needs for evaluation in particular schools and also needing to have some systematic data so that you can disaggregate and look for where are those areas where we need to do further investment or recalibrate or check in with our communities and see what we can do to be more effective and supportive. One of the areas that we're going here in Central Oregon is, in addition to taking that long range look for outcomes like increased attendance, reduced disciplinary referrals, and academic achievement, we're actually also looking at measuring resilience. So student resilience, staff resilience, and knowing that resilience is actually a process. It's not something just internal, right, to myself or a student or a teacher, but it's a process between ourselves and our communities that we live in. And so if we're able to create cultures of care in schools, then we're increasing resilience factors so that students are, when we have a resilience survey, for example, students should be over time reporting that they feel respected. They feel like they're treated fairly. They have a sense of belonging at school. And those are some of those resilience factors that we're measuring.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add that in addition to some of the resilience factors that we're tracking, at my school specifically, we're tracking student interaction with counselors and teacher conversations, just to ensure that we're hearing what the themes are within our school, and being able to address and meet some of those needs and getting to where students are at versus just, it's important on the community level, but starting where we're at also. Yeah. So that's been something that we're doing in Crook County.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to prioritize both student resilience and adult resilience? I know certainly using the terminology around resilience is a newer concept for Central Oregon, although we've always been in tune with and interested in kind of social and emotional components of learning. But what does it mean to prioritize resilience as an outcome in our schools? And what does that look like?
I've always thought that resilience is the antidote to ACEs or trauma. And so this notion of building resilience for adults and students is sort of the aim that, you know, I think if we continue to do those things and put systems in place that support that type of work, that we're going to be heading in the right direction. Yeah, that's basically.
I would say also, what does it mean to support adults' resilience as part of the work? It means that we're getting at the heart of it. It means that we're really being serious about this work and understanding that the way adults show up, right? We bring ourselves to our engagement, to our interactions, to our relationships with young people, and we need to bring our best selves. How do we do that? We need to feel safe. We need to feel supported and empowered as well. And that's hard work, and that's why we need systems. And not putting all that pressure on the teacher, the staff member alone.
You know, I think of things through a regulatory framework. So, you know, a dysregulated adult can't help regulate a dysregulated kid. And so a lot of the times when there's conflict or when a student who's experienced trauma or for whatever reason is having a difficult time, that response and that reaction from the adult can change the trajectory of how that goes for that student and for that particular incident. And so I think it's important that adults acknowledge that we have our own stuff, and that we have to acknowledge how we enter into a conversation with a student.
Well, and another thing too that comes to mind for me with this part of the conversation, because this is a big part of it, is how vulnerable that can be to be the teacher in that place. I heard someone mention earlier the kind of accountability or judgment that's placed on teachers for their student success, for their student behavior, and so being safe and supported in that space and being allowed to be vulnerable is what is ultimately going to allow us to do the really hard work of things like we have to examine our implicit bias and knowing that it's implicit, it's not there. It might not always be in our awareness that the way I'm engaging with a person of color is going to be different perhaps because of those implicit biases that society has infused in me. And that to be able to do that requires that I'm safe and I'm supported as well.
Speaking of implicit bias, what is true about our panel today is that we are all white. And when we talk about trauma, we hear a lot about adverse childhood experiences, but we don't hear as much about historical trauma that communities of color have faced historically and frankly in our communities continue to face today. And a question I would pose to the panel around that, as well as acknowledging it, is what are you doing in your communities, in your schools, in your work to ensure that we're not only thinking about historical trauma that young people are experiencing, communities of color are experiencing, but to engage and to be co-designing systems with communities of color in these spaces?
Yes.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
I can speak, and Ben, we're nearing the end of a process. We call it the Excellence in Equity Review. It's the first time we've done it, but we held over 36 listening sessions with underserved populations and parents and student groups. So speaking of student voices, we had lots of student voice, and I actually was able to facilitate a couple of the student panels, students representing students with disabilities. And we are taking that data and we are creating a continuous improvement plan. And as part of that continuous improvement plan and listening to the voices of the people that we serve, one of the lessons we're taking and are going to move forward with is we're going to continue to keep these panels alive and open throughout so that we continue to get feedback. Because we want to do better, and if we don't listen and we don't understand sort of the perspectives of everyone we serve, we're not going to get better in that way. So I think that's kind of our main aim at this point.
Thank you. I think in St. Louis, we try to really hold ourselves accountable to the recommendations of the Ferguson Commission. They went through an incredible year-long process of doing very meaningful community engagement and uncovering those true realities of what it's going to take to make St. Louis an equitable place to live. And so organizationally and in our work, we try to hold ourselves accountable to those standards. And I think additionally, in that, we try to build in equity markers for how we're selecting who's participating in this given program. Even talking real talk, right, when we think about how do we make a financial structure for a nonprofit to do this work, we want to make sure that how we are building an organization isn't going to result in as soon as a grant leaves, then once again, schools with the fewest resources are going to have that support and service moved out. And so I think we really think at a structural level, how do we do this? And then again, taking that approach that when it comes to trauma-informed, while there are lots of folks like the people on this webinar today who know a lot about trauma, no one except the person inside a system knows how to make their system trauma-informed. And so how do we even approach talking about this work from shifting of here's exactly what you need to do to make everything happen to how can I be a steward with your wisdom? How can I connect it with maybe something I know, but you have an answer already, right? And how do we actually work together in that way?
One of the things that we have heard and are learning from in Central Oregon, and we've heard particularly from communities of color, is the importance of co-design, but also the importance of affinity space. And so we have more recently, based on, again, feedback from communities of color, been resourcing and working to support affinity space where communities of color within their communities can be designing and discussing and providing feedback to our education systems that then our administrators and educators, as Sean mentioned, have taken very critically and seriously into their continuous improvement plans. And that helps address some of what we all know is true, which is around many of our decision-making tables. Dominant culture is the designer, and that is not always safe and or welcoming space for many people across our community. And so we're trying to take seriously and think differently about what engagement looks like and how, frankly, to share power in those decision-making spaces. Those are all really great examples. I'd like to shift a little bit to kind of higher level policy implications of some of this work. So as we know, Oregon and many other states are facing some pretty startling mental health crises, as well as an urgent need to increase education outcomes for young people. So what opportunities exist at the state level for integrated policymaking to improve both education and health outcomes? What state level opportunities are there either in Missouri or in Oregon that that help that work or even hinder similar work?
So I think, first of all, I think what's powerful about trauma-informed work at that kind of big P policy level is the way in which this really is not a partisan issue, right? And there are ways to find paths forward. If we all want kids who are coming out of school prepared to be the kinds of citizens and leaders that we want them to be, and this trauma-informed work is a critical component of how we get there. I would say in terms of how do we get big P policy that supports this, again, there's a fine line between, trauma-informed isn't something we can mandate someone to do, right? Mandating someone to hold a fundamental belief isn't a super effective way to get there. But how can we mandate structures to be in place? How can we shift what accountability looks like? When we look at things like what earns schools accreditation points, are we also considering the things that are supporting the well-being of their students, or are we only looking at attendance or test scores? So I think there's a lot of power that lives at the state to positively incentivize schools to take this, as well as to make the resources available. This isn't a resource-free effort. You need time, you need expertise, you need training, development, learning, right? How can that level of policy go into actually making this possible for schools to do?
I would say it's more of a practice level discussion than a policy level discussion, because the intersection with trauma has been discipline a lot. And so if our goals are to graduate 90%, 95% of our students, we have to do things differently. We have to find ways to reach more students and accommodate different styles of learning and different types of learning. So I think primarily it's, from the policy of wanting to have as many kids graduate, that is a great driver for it as well. I just think about the way I came into this work was how our systems were created to address trauma and dysregulation through a discipline lens, and that lens typically left kids not in school anymore. And when kids aren't in school, their outcomes aren't very good, and they're not contributing to society. And we've sort of taken them out of the game, if you will. And so it's just imperative that we find ways to continue to educate them, that we expand our repertoire for what it means to educate kids, and give them success beyond high school.
I would say, too, just to kind of piggyback on that, when we think about what a state's opportunities are to affect this work through policy, remembering that trauma-informed schools and the things directly related to education are just really one piece of what goes into that. And so also when states take initiative to lower the amount of kids living in poverty or who are coming to school hungry, when we actually address community violence and over-policing, right? When we at a state level look at all of these things that are going into feeding the ongoing community trauma our kids have coming into our schools, we might not look at that and say, oh, this is something helping to build a trauma-informed school. But if it's changing the circumstances our students come from, changing the communities that our schools are serving, that's a trauma-informed school intervention.
Yeah, and using trauma-informed language and thinking, it turns the mirror from, so behavior lens would, it always is pointing out that the student is doing something wrong or that it's within the student. But when we think of it from a trauma lens, it really talks about adult actions and shapes our mindset around how we can be the difference maker, how we can change our systems and what we do to change the outcomes for students. And so, again, I think that as a practice, but also just a policy in the way of thinking about our responsibility societally and as institutions and as adults in those institutions, how we can create greater opportunity.
So along the policy and youth line, recently youth activists in Oregon led the charge to pass a law that allows young people, students, to take mental health days from schools. So what role can young people play in advancing some of these broader policies and practices like trauma-informed schools that actually affect their own well-being? We heard a bit about that earlier. What would you add to that?
Well, so House Bill 2191, I believe is what it is a great example of student voice coming to the legislature and leading for the adults, quite frankly. It's largely a destigmatization effort around talking about mental health. And our students are not afraid to talk about mental health. We are, our parents are, we're the ones who have, sort of developed the stigma around discussing it, but the youth are leading the way for us and lending their voice. And, everyone needs a break at times, and it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to understand that mental health sort of lives on a continuum, and we all have our downs, and sometimes sometimes folks are really struggling. The other side of that is there's also positive mental health, and that's where I'd like to say that the school's role is to we promote positive mental health. We put in systems in place and things that develop students' sense of wellness, and that's also part of the role too. So it just opens up the conversation and the importance that the schools play a role in that, and that we need to talk about it.
I think it also opens up communication for students to be honest and to share that viewpoint, like, it's too much today, and I need that minute. And I think that adults can learn from that in being able to communicate that. It's not just about having everyone take into consideration what they need, but it's also hearing it, right? It's about asking, and it's about having that space, and just knowing that today I might need a break.
And I hope we see more of it. This was one great example. We heard another one earlier about youth sharing about the needs to fix bathrooms and make them more empowering. And I'm sure there are many more examples out there that elude us from our perspective, and would love to look forward to hearing from more of those ideas from you.
Yeah. So Emily, you all have talked about, when we think about outcomes, some of the disproportionality that we know exists. We know disproportionate discipline exists for students of color and for students with disabilities in our schools. We know that some youth are more likely to encounter trauma in their lives at home, also potentially through some of our school policies and practices. And that makes trauma-informed practices really critical if those groups of young people are to succeed. But how do we make the case that trauma-informed practices are something that all young people need, that school-wide, all young people will thrive if we're able to implement these practices well?
So I think we start with something that people can connect with really easily, which is that trauma is universal, right? And whether we look at the data that we have that points to the high prevalence, or you just ask a person to reflect for a second how many people they know that have experienced some type of trauma, we can very often easily get people, right, to the point of, yeah, that makes sense, trauma's all around us. And I think also looking to other examples in the trauma-informed movement that have shown us that, if you do have, as I always say, the magical unicorn of the student in your school who's never experienced anything that overwhelmed their capacity, if you treat them in a way that assumes they have, you'll do no harm. Right? It is a risk-free thing to do. And so one of the things that we always stress is that taking this universal approach to the prevalence of trauma is essential, right? That we don't need to put our educators in the business of now diagnosing students' ACE scores and figuring out exactly they have enough jobs to do. And so, again, we have the data that tells us it's safe to make that assumption. And what can, I think, sometimes happen in that powerful universal language is we have to then continue to center the fact that trauma is not equitably affecting in terms of outcome and access to support our communities. But it's possible to hold both of those things to be true. Right? So much of what trauma-informed work is about is being able to hold multiple things at the same time. And again, I think that if we can tell the story, if we invite people to see their own schools, their own communities in that, they see how that shows out. And again, our youth are often ready to tell that experience, right? Our youth are willing to share, yeah, here's the reality of how hard it is to be me or how hard it is to be young in this day and age. And also, right, here's all the history that shows us why we need to be centering our youth of color, our professionals of color, and finding the answers that we need to move forward.
And to shift the culture in schools, we need to take a school-wide, a community-wide approach. That's a cultural approach, and that requires a universal lens.
I think too, just being consistent about talking to everyone the same, asking the same questions, making sure that we are across the board looking at the same thing and addressing everyone for that specific, rather than trying to compare things that don't match up, and making sure that we're sensitive to it as well. So.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have one more question for the panel, but I want to take a moment to encourage you all to write in with any questions that you have for the panel. We'll have some time after this discussion to take some of those questions and have a conversation about them. So please share as you're thinking through what this looks like in your communities. So I'm going to get really concrete. We talk quite a bit about trauma-informed practices in our schools. I'm curious for all of you, what stands out when you think of a trauma-informed practice? Can you give a concrete example of what that looks like when it is done well in a school building, between an adult and a student, or within a policy? What is a practice that stands out for you that you'd be willing to share?
For myself, since I am actually in the schools and I see students every day, not only for myself but for teachers too, is to take notice of the youth when they come into school, and just kind of seeing where they're at. I mean, we see our students every day. We get a feel for who they are, some of their norms, some of their ways of being, if you will, and we can acknowledge when it's different. So just being in tune with meeting students where they are, and that can vary from day to day. So just being open to what you're seeing and curious. I think that's my word, is curious. Not that you want to, dive deep into all the details necessarily, but just being curious about how you can support them and how it's going on a day to day.
I would say you'd walk into a school and there'd be a variety of different spaces. So I think about the physical environment of schools. So acknowledging that students within a classroom or within a school might need a break. And so having opportunities and either scheduled breaks or breaks that they need, just opportunities for them to make different choices, from, get regulated if they need to, and just offering them the opportunity to make a different choice and to accommodate the need around that.
One that's coming to mind that I just saw during school observation last week was to remember that part of relationship building and creating this safe, supportive environment is also remembering that there are children, and that fun is an appropriate thing to have at school. And so it's just at a school where, again, realizing that sometimes lunchtime can be a major opportunity for conflict, for behavioral challenges. They have a dance party in their cafeteria every day. They pull in the speakers, they play songs that kids pick, and they dance, right? Not only we could get into all of how that's a great thing for their brain and they're getting this movement out, but also they're having an opportunity for fun. The principal's down there with them, often live streaming or dancing with them, right? And having those opportunities, because again, I think it can be easy in trauma-informed work to focus on the heavy, right, or the serious, but we're dealing with kids, and kids heal through fun as well. And so finding schools that know how to strike that balance is a really important thing.
Great. So we are going to move into questions, and we have one from the audience. Thank you. We talked a little bit about measurement, and so let's dig into that a bit more. How do you measure progress in this work that can often seem so nebulous and squishy? Do you use youth participatory action research or lifescaping action research as forms of assessment? How are youth involved in that, and what does that look like?
Through our school district, we do a lot of self-reporting. So there's assessments that are done at the beginning of the year, and then we incorporate questions too about coping skills and management, feeling safe, whether that be at school, on your walk home, or to and from school, and trying to really get their voice. And we do that multiple times throughout the year. So it's not just once at the beginning of the year and say, okay, these are our areas, but it's being proactive. It's getting the questions, getting the answers, and then addressing them, and then asking again. and doing the same kind of process. So it's throughout the year to make sure that we're hearing, seeing, and knowing kind of what's going on with our youth at that time.
I would say we are early in setting up systems for evaluation and research and data here, and we have really strong partnership with the High Desert Education Service District with data systems. We have school teams meeting with care coaches who are very focused on data and research and meeting with us as university research as well. So we have this great foundation, but we haven't yet even gotten to the real research piece and really being able to ask those critical questions of how we're going to track progress beyond, we know we're measuring resilience, we know we're measuring attendance and discipline and academic outcomes, but really getting at these processes of change taking place through things like youth participatory action research. We need to figure this out still. We're early.
I would agree. The resilience measure is helpful on a very broad basis, but getting student voice, and Tamara mentioned a few of them, but we have youth advisory councils, which again they're powerful because it's the most outspoken youth and well-spoken youth and unafraid to spoke youth. Will get out and sort of say it how it is. But it really is trying to find ongoing engagement and just understand lived experience and know how, if what we're doing is having an impact and if it's working, if they see the difference and if it feels different for them in their schools.
So one of the big parts of how we measure progress is we are guided by something called the Missouri Model for Trauma-Informed Schools. And not only does that, it's sort of a high level moving from trauma-aware, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive to trauma-informed, give us a way to self-assess organizationally for schools, but we also have developed a specific Missouri Model for Trauma-Informed Schools framework that has 12 key indicators where schools are continually sort of monitoring their progress. That matches a lot of the kinds of indicators that schools are held to in other areas. And so we're really trying to, again, get it into that systemic way of, hey, if you're measuring how you're doing serving your students in this area, how are you also measuring your trauma-informed progress in a similar framework?
And I think I would just add for Central Oregon, as Sean mentioned, we are really considering resilience to be the antidote to trauma. And so even measuring resilience, we have a tool that was created in partnership with Oregon State University Cascades and Traces, our trauma-informed movement locally. But we have been measuring resilience in our school districts for over 25,000 young people for the last 2 years. And so we look at things like, do I have an adult in my life who cares about me? Do I know where to go for help? I mean, the measure has been, that is progress for us as a region, and I don't want to take just the implementation of that measure lightly. And in Crook County School District, we're measuring adult resilience as well, and that is a powerful indicator.
I'd say the other really powerful thing about that measure in particular is that we here collectively and Central Oregon schools are part of a region-wide movement. So resilience is something that schools can contribute to and can really nurture. It isn't just the responsibility of schools. And so the pressure to nurture resilience isn't just held within teachers and schools and school buildings and districts, but is a community effort. And so with the Traces movement, we really are being a leader in the measurement around resilience. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question. How can trauma-informed practices support students with disabilities? Are schools considering evidence and history of trauma as a part of the 504 evaluation process?
I can speak to that. There's, with students with disabilities, there's lots of intersectionality with trauma. We see it all the time, and there are certainly eligibility categories that would have students who have a higher degree of trauma would be more prevalent. For example, emotional disturbance. There's not really a consideration of trauma as a part of the 504 eval process, but on the other side of that, there's actually a rule out that when we're going through the eligibility process for pretty much any educational diagnoses, is we have to rule out economic disadvantage and sort of things that would relate to traumatic experiences and things like that. And so what we see is that students who have high degree of ACEs come to us with lots of symptomology that points towards different disability categories. So it's very hard to separate the two things because they're so interrelated and tied together.
One thing we've just begun doing in Missouri is we have a partnership with the Missouri Developmental Disabilities Coalition, and we've been developing some specific curriculum for educators on how to support students with disabilities. And so part of that is actually just raising awareness amongst educators about the community and historical trauma experienced by students and individuals with disabilities, as well as really looking at some social role valorization techniques, which is a major component of how we can sort of combat this systemic devaluation of our students with disabilities as a trauma-informed approach. And so we're working with schools across the state on diving into that. So what are ways that systemically you are continuing this devaluation of these students? What specific practices or policy adjustments do we need to put in place to interrupt that cycle?
I do think it begs the larger question. If you have a high degree of adverse experiences, does that mean you're disabled, right? And so I take a more conservative lens that alone should not indicate that a student has or a child has a disability, and that it's our responsibility to intervene and to try to, again, create spaces where kids have opportunities in our schools. And it's not just, the only avenue or the only way to intervene is to say, no, you have a disability and then you can get help. And, it's our job as an entire system to find ways to help those students without marginalizing them even more potentially.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question, discipline has come up quite a bit. Can you share more specifics about how schools are or can be implementing restorative justice practices, discipline shifts, and what that looks like?
Sure. My framework for any, of course, in my job, I get to interact quite a bit with behavior and discipline because of, obviously, there's a disproportionality with students with disabilities. But the framework I think of is that anytime we're in a conversation with a student after something's happened, is the action that we're taking going to A, increase the relationship we have with that student, and B, decrease the likelihood that that behavior will occur again. And so call it restorative justice, call it restorative practices. At the end of the day, it needs to be relationship building, and it needs to help the student find a better way to handle a situation and give them avenues to do that. So I think that, again, when we talk about trying to find ways to accommodate students and try to adapt to students' needs, we have to take these teachable moments and utilize them and grow help the student grow, but also help the community grow. Because oftentimes when we talk about adult resilience, and adults are impacted when things happen with students and our own personal stuff comes up. And so it's not just for the kid that was involved or the student that's involved, it was for everybody that was involved. And so I think that, quite frankly, it's the future of how we handle situations, but every school is going to do it a little bit differently, and that's a work in progress.
Yeah, I could speak for Kirk County that at least within my school, alternative population, sometimes they're quick to shut down, be dismissive, which in turns causes teachers sometimes to shut down and that sort of thing. So something that we definitely have been trying to do is open up that communications more so than just sending a youth to a principal or to the discipline component. And while discipline's not my area, I try to be involved just because there are emotions involved and there are other components. And so opening up those lines of communication, not just about the discipline, but about the emotional connection between the teacher and potentially the youth, and then the situation, and then how to correct it for both. Not just the youth and their behavior, but also for the teachers and be able to manage their emotions that are coming up and the situation itself. So it is a work in progress for sure.
I'll add something if I might, just for a moment. So I was just last week chatting with, working as a workshop actually with a group of early childhood teachers. And we were brainstorming all the different ways that we notice and identify children's needs. And we were working to center behavioral challenges within the middle of that conversation. So seeing behavior as a signal for a child's needs. And what does that tell us? Is the child needing to feel safer? Is the child needing more power, or they need to feel more cared for or valued? You know, are those a trauma-informed approach to a behavioral challenge, right? And then does that shift the conversation about what to do if that gives us some new insights on kids' needs?
Another very tangible practice we're using in Central Oregon, we hear restorative justice and we think discipline. And one of the things we're working on through the culture of care is actually to create restorative cultures that exist far before we get to a discipline issue. And a really concrete example I'll give is we hear a lot from students of color about race-based bullying that occurs and teachers not intervening. And so when we have those conversations with teachers say, I don't know how to do that well. I don't know what that looks like. And so a practice that we've been implementing is training for cohorts of teachers and giving them the opportunities to practice intervening in those bullying incidents so that when they re-enter the classroom, they know how to do that to address an issue far before it gets to discipline. That's creating restorative culture. And that's been something that we're learning in Central Oregon. So I think we have time for one more question, and that is, how do you address mindset with teachers and educational caregivers who are experiencing trauma as well?
So I think this is essential, and I think what we have found is most of our schools, when they look at this big call of becoming trauma-informed and ask where to start, is they realize they need to start by shifting the well-being of their educators. I come to this work not as an educator, but as the wife and daughter and sister of educators, and I have a strong personal interest in not asking them to do one more thing. Right? They have 100 million jobs already, and I think centering that and actually walking the walk of saying, we say over and over again that relationship with a healthy adult is the best intervention we can give a kid. When are we actually going to value having a healthy adult? So what does that look like from a policy perspective? What does that look like from administrators actually supporting this and shifting that culture? Because I think what I find is that when you have a teacher who is well, there's not a teacher that's not going to buy into this, right? I think a lot of our resistance doesn't come from a lack of buy-in, it comes from a lack of bandwidth. And so when we shift this and we say, hey, this is actually about how we can make you well enough to be the kind of educator you want to be, it's a very different ask than here's the 12 new things you need to do in your classroom today.
Yeah. And to add to that component, in Crook County, the 12 additional building champions, I'll call them, they received some additional training, so they were able to meet with teachers that are in need and trying to send out, continuous reminders, like if you're struggling, connect with your building champion, get the resources, ask the questions. You're not alone, you're not on an island. And so just really trying to be mindful about the teachers need that support too, and that life is going to happen to our teachers, not just at school, but their own personal lives. And so just really kind of meeting that too, and having those people available to help support this work. Because again, as I believe, it's a way of life. It's not just a mindset for at school or while you're on the job. This is truly how we should be living our lives as a whole.
The only thing I would add is in Ben Lapine right now with our Culture of Care grant that we have, regional grant, and we have 3 care coaches. And our care coaches we have priority schools that are getting some primary coaching this year. And through the needs assessment process that all those buildings have done, the first order of business with pretty much all of the schools is to work on their teachers and to work on a culture of care among the teaching staff. And those teams have all sort of unanimously decided that's what they're going to do. And so I think that says a lot about the values that we place on keeping ourselves healthy if we're gonna be working with our students. So what their work is remains to be seen, but I think the value's there.
Go ahead. That's the beauty and challenge of trauma-informed, is that it isn't just in the classroom. It requires a big commitment of the system and of leaders and administration to support the teachers in the work with counselors and coaches.
And I'm hearing a how from all of you that investing in adults whose job it is to invest in the mental health, in the care of other adults is a strategy. And so that's
Absolutely
exciting to hear that that's being elevated. Thank you so much, panel, for joining us today and for just digging into the work that you're doing and sharing that. We were thrilled to have an opportunity to join all of you, and I'm now going to bring Nico Connolly back up, and he's going to close us out.
All right, thanks everybody for joining the Culture of Care event. That concludes our event today. I want to say a special thank you to all our speakers and panelists that we've heard from today for being so profound and vulnerable and letting us into really the nuts and bolts of their everyday work to help young people succeed in schools and in their communities. I want to say a big thank you to Katie Condit and Stacy Smith from Cook County Schools for hosting this fantastic event. And then lastly, I want to say a huge thanks to the people who tuned in via the live stream. The conversation in the YouTube chat has been just as rich as the conversation here on the panel and in the youth engagement session. And so I really want to say thanks to you all too for joining us and really bringing your full selves to that conversation. We hope you'll continue that conversation, and we look forward to staying in touch with you and continuing to follow your important work. And thanks a lot, and have a great day.